you have to eliminate agencies. You can't just trim them because they're like weeds. Weeds will grow back.
Today's guest is Ted DeHaven, who is a policy analyst at the Cato Institute, a former deputy budget director of Indiana, and he also served as a policy advisor in the U.S. Senate. Thank you, Tad, for joining us today.
Thanks, Jesse. It's nice to be on. Appreciate it.
So the legacy media has opposed Elon Musk, President Trump, and Doge, yet the majority of Americans in polling overwhelmingly support what Elon Musk and Doge is doing to expose the government waste, fraud, and abuse, as Doge has been auditing various government departments. Why does this matter to the American people that they're overwhelmingly in support of this? And why is the legacy media so hell-bent on talking about constitutional crises and kind of bashing this whole endeavor?
Wow, that's a pretty heavy question to lead off with. And so I'm going to start by saying that I have ranging views on this that aren't all in one camp and aren't another. And in fact, these views seem to change as the days progress. I wake up in the morning, I pick up my phone. The first thing I think to myself is, I wonder what I missed at 2:00 in the morning. So things happen fast, things can change. So what do we know about Doge is that Trump embraces this idea that Musk comes up with before the election is over. Talk about coming in, we're going to cut $2 trillion of spending. If we build this commission, Trump wins the election. We're going to have a Doge. We don't know what it's going to look like. Is it going to be outside the government? Is it going to be officially part of the government? So from the beginning, there's been a lot of questions. And the first concrete steps to sort of establish this as a formal organization within the executive branch is an executive order that the president issues, I believe, the first day in office, establishing Doge. The interesting thing about it is it really doesn't speak to cutting spending. It speaks more towards changing an office that was in charge of digital services in the Treasury, renaming it the Doge and focusing on updating technology and payment systems and such within the government, which is a worthy cause because, as you can imagine, governments are very good at spending money on the big, visible, pretty things. When it comes to technology and payment systems and things like that, it's not sexy. It doesn't get the press release. It's not something you talk about during a presidential debate. So those things sort of fall by the wayside. So, in itself, that's a worthy endeavor to look at it. But, from where I'm sitting after 25 years of both inside and outside of government pushing for spending cuts, the first concern is, okay, you're sort of moving the goalposts here. It was about cutting spending, and now we're talking about digital services. Now, some people speculated that, hey, they're just doing the executive order, focusing on the digital stuff. Once you get the Trojan horse inside the walls, then they can go do things. And to a degree, I think we've seen that. And so, as you mentioned, they've been going after different agencies and looking for waste, fraud, and abuse. Two things here. One, waste, fraud, and abuse. I have no problem with going after waste, fraud, and abuse. I said years ago in congressional testimony that waste, fraud, and abuse goes with government programs the way peanut butter and jelly goes with a sandwich. I mean, it's inherent. So by all means, go after it. The problem I have seen at this point is twofold. One, some of the things that they're saying is waste or fraud, well, specifically fraud, isn't fraud. Yesterday, we had the allegation from Musk that he uncovered, or his employees at Doge uncovered, one of the biggest scandals in history with Social Security payments to dead people, trillions of dollars in savings. That's simply not true. They didn't understand what they're looking at. The details aren't completely there yet because they hold the data they're playing with. But on its face, when I saw it on Twitter or X, I looked at it and was like, something's wrong there. And so I see the media then run articles on Doge, Musk, Trump, White House finds all this fraud in Social Security. And millions of people then tune into their preferred network to watch the quote unquote news that night. And they're told that today they found trillions of dollars in fraud in Social Security. The problem is now you have millions of people that think that Social Security's problem is trillions of dollars of fraud. No, Social Security's problem is it promises too much in benefits and there's not enough workers to pay those benefits. Social Security is going broke and you got to do something about it. And now the convenient excuse has been given to Donald Trump, who has said from the beginning he doesn't want to touch Social Security. He's going to, no chance he touches it. Now Donald Trump can simply say, hey, we did address Social Security. We eliminated $1 trillion in fraud and everything's fine with the program right now. And so that to me is a huge problem, and it's a huge disservice to the American people to not understand the fiscal dire straits we're in, that we're in a situation where you can't just keep accumulating this debt. And to getting back to the second point, then, it is eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse is fine, but when 70% of federal spending, we're going to spend $7 trillion this year. 70% of this comes from Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, interest on the debt. That's where the money's at. And so if you think that eliminating some grants, $1 million here and $1 million there, is going to make an appreciable dent in the deficit and debt, I hate to break it to you, you're wrong. It's good. Go after those things. Do those things. But also do it correctly. Do it and put out correct information. We want to build public support because ultimately Congress is the one that's going to have to do the cutting. And if you just put out stuff that's not true, then it makes it easier for the mainstream media, which, as you implied, doesn't want to be friendly towards this, is inclined to be disfriendly towards it, right? You know, they don't name a time the media's ever cheerleaded spending cuts or the idea of, right? So don't give your enemies the noose to hang yourself with. Square with the American people. And so that's my concern is, yeah, we're heading towards the right place. We're talking about spending cuts, but again, do it accurately and be square with the American people about what the actual magnitude of this is going to be.
In 2019, the U.S. federal budget was about, their revenue was like $3.46 trillion, but the U.S. government spent $4.45 trillion. So this would have been kind of pre-pandemic. And then now in the last budget I saw was 2024 was almost $7 trillion. And then back in 2015, the federal budget spent $3.7 trillion. So we've almost doubled the federal spending since 2015. Like, what's happened? Like, and you know, the pandemic's been over also for a couple of years now. Like, why are we still spending $7 trillion a year?
Big part of it's demographics. So again, your biggest budgetary drivers, and people don't want to hear this, is Social Security and Medicaid and things like that. And those programs, contrary to the myth that when you paid FICA taxes throughout your life, that they're sitting in some vault in the Treasury waiting for you to retire. No, all those taxes you paid went to people who were retired at the time and received those benefits. All right, your money's gone. The Supreme Court ruled on that decades ago and said you have no property right to your FICA taxes. They're gone. They're going to the same place as your income taxes. So it worked like any Ponzi scheme does when you have enough people in the workforce paying FICA taxes to support the number of beneficiaries out there. Well, the baby boomers are retiring and they've had less children. So you have a reduced workforce and more beneficiaries, and thus the cost is going up on top of the fact that through the decades, the Congress has made Social Security benefits more generous. And they're hooked to inflation. So when we had the high inflation in the last 3 years, you saw 8% benefit increases for Social Security beneficiaries. And it's the same story with Medicare. We're an aging population. We're getting older. We have great new technologies, great new medicines, but they're very expensive. People are living longer. And obviously, the longer you live, the more health problems you have and the costlier it is. And so whether it's your portion of FICA taxes for Medicare Part A or your general revenue taxes, those costs go up. Military spending continues to go up. It's obviously under the Biden administration, we have this massive industrial policy with the CHIPS Act, the notion that the federal government can pick winners and losers in the tech industry and the microprocessor industry. You had the green subsidies, which there's still an opportunity here for the Trump administration to claw back. That would be very helpful. Congress could do that as well. That'd be very helpful. I have doubts about that. So, I had a cover piece back in 2005 in National Review on George W. Bush's spending blowout. And I remember one year, maybe it's like 2006 or something, Congress was proposing like a $35 billion emergency supplemental bill. And at the time, that was a big deal, like $35 billion extra. Nowadays, it's, 300 billion, 500 billion. I mean, we're looking at a $2 trillion deficit this year. We're looking at deficits as a percentage of GDP around where we haven't seen since World War II. And obviously, World War II is sort of a one-off because you didn't have the massive welfare state and you're fighting World War II. So something has to give at some point. And so I guess that's, we're on this autopilot. And actually, to circle back to your first question and why I complain about focusing on waste, fraud, and abuse is because I've seen this for 25 years. When a politician talks about waste, fraud, and abuse, hold your wallet, because it's almost 100% of the time, it's a telltale sign that they're not truly serious about spending cuts. And even if we can't move the needle on that, Musk had a great quote the other day. He was asked about Doge, and he something like, you have to eliminate agencies. You can't just trim them because they're like weeds. Weeds will grow back. And I saw that quote and I was like, Elon, that's it. Now you're getting it. You cut the so-called waste, fraud, and abuse out of the Department of Education or name any agency or department of the federal government, it's still there. It's like the multi-headed hydra. You cut one head off and another head grows back, right? So what's really important is to focus on pulling the roots out. That means cutting down an agency and shuttering it. Sort of what they look like they're doing with USAID, although it does seem to me that you need congressional approval with that. And so this is the second part of the strategy that I would like to see. Is it seemed like initially there was outreach between Doge and Congress set up respective in the Senate and the House Doge committees. But this idea that the federal government, that this just one branch of the government can cut spending and cut agencies and cut departments, that's just simply not true. It's not going to happen. I hate to disappoint people, but we are supposed to have three co-equal branches of government. And you need Congress to sign off on this. You need their involvement. So again, be accurate, be honest, and work with Congress. And if at the end of the day, Congress doesn't go along with what you're promoting and utilizing these resources that are out there that you're discovering, and that the Cato Institute has sent tons of stuff to Doge, the GAO has tons of reports out there, Inspector Generals have tons of reports out there. You put that all out there, and if Congress says, know what, Doge, you know what, Trump administration, we're not doing it, then they're the problem. That's you've done your part, right? But it's just the sort of cut spending by executive fiat via X. I'm concerned where this goes long term. I'm getting concerned that they could ultimately prove counterproductive rather than productive.
What do you think about all the USAID stuff that's come out? I mean, has that always been a department that's have a lot of fraud and abuse, or is that over exaggerated? Or
I think they have. Every agency has fraud and abuse. I mean, it comes with government programs, and fraud and abuse are like peanut butter and jelly. They just go together. So you're always going to have it. And actually that brings up a good point, is if you want to pull out the roots, it has to be about more than fraud and abuse. You have to make principal arguments about why the federal government shouldn't be funding these things, why it shouldn't be doing these things. So what I would like to hear is not so much that USAID spent $1 million for a grant in Cambodia for a LGBTQ dance or something like that. I get that. That's catnip for your base. That's catnip for your. I understand all that stuff. But if you want to get rid of USAID, you need to make a more fundamental philosophical point about the problem with U.S. foreign aid to begin with. Maybe talk about how foreign aid to Africa hoses over farmers there and undercuts their prices and leaves them desperate for foreign aid because they can't compete while we subsidize our farmers to the tune of billions of dollars a year. You know, that's where you have to make the dent. That's where you have to try to appeal to people. You have to try to appeal across the aisle. I mean, it sounds futile and silly to say, but you have to do it. You have to make the effort, and at least make the effort with the American people. So, yeah, again, waste, fraud, and abuse, that's fine. Go after it, but don't make it sound like that's the problem. It's a byproduct of the problem. The problem is the existence of the program to begin with. Focus your fire on that. Make the case for that.
You know, a few months ago when this whole Doge thing came out, I had Scott Hodge on, who at the time was president of the Tax Foundation. And this was when Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, when he was still in it, said that they were going to cut $2 trillion. And then, of course, we just kind of like did the math, like you basically said. I mean, 70 cents on the dollar are from Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, interest on the debt, and on the defense. And then if you add in like VA benefits and some of the other entitlement programs like SNAP, whatever, it brings it at over 80 cents to the dollar. I think it was more like 85 cents to the dollar.
Yeah.
And then I was reading reports that talk about how there may be between $250 billion to $1 trillion a year of fraud, waste, abuse. Even if you want to take the high end of that and say the 1 trillion, well, then we still would be running a $1 trillion deficit a year, which just means we're going to keep compounding this national debt, you know, of over $36 trillion.
Right.
So, and I think, you know, Doge.gov, they have their own website now, and they said that they've saved the taxpayers basically $55 trillion, or trillion, that'd be pretty awesome right now, $55 billion. But from what I was reading, a lot of those numbers are extrapolated like 30 years out. Yeah, maybe you saved a contract that was $1 billion a year, but that, you know, you were reporting it as, say, 20 years because it's a 20-year contract or whatever. But realistically, the only way that we're ever going to get the national deficit of $36 trillion, or the national debt of $36 trillion under control, is to mess with Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and no politician wants to touch that with a 5,000-foot pole because you're going to get destroyed. Yeah, President Trump cannot be reelected, but that would look really bad for the Republican Party, as well as, say, J.D. Vance, who would never get elected if you just, you know, effed with Social Security. So basically, nothing of note will ever be accomplished is basically, you know, the short way of what I just said for 5 minutes.
Yeah, this is the part of the conversation where I always kind of like, I hate talking about this, because the dynamics are such, as you just laid out, pretty discouraging. And there's no doubt about it, if cutting spending was easy, we'd have done it by now. I'd probably be on the beach somewhere instead of talking to you, right?
We'll be talking to each other on the beach. That's the positive. Right.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd be in Puerto Rico with you right now sipping tequila. Exactly. But, you know, unfortunately, I think it's going to take a bad situation for people to start to have a comeuppance, you know, have that come to Jesus moment. You know, I did get a little bit of hope, and this is, I hope, I put hope in air quotes because it's a shame it takes something like this to provide hope. But, you know, people did really just get a good taste of inflation over the past 3 years. They're still angry about it. Prices are still elevated. And we can talk about this later, but could be going up even further because of trade policies under the current administration. People hated it. I mean, it single-handedly was the issue that Harris and you could say Biden lost that election to Trump, was inflation. And, you know, if the way we're going, if you didn't like what we had for those 3 years, just and wait until bond traders start to demand higher and higher interest payments to purchase that debt, which means financing is going to be more expensive. And you get to the point then where you're looking at the Federal Reserve monetizing debt, and you're going to get inflation like you haven't seen. To quote Trump, like you haven't seen, right? Inflation like you haven't seen. And I hope that's not what happens. I hope we can I guess the best hope right now is debt stabilization. The current path we're on, the current path under assumed law with the Congressional Budget Office, the path we would take with the rather small spending cuts we'd get out of the GOP House and Senate this year, according to their budget resolutions, would do nothing to stabilize the debt. It just wouldn't. It's not enough. And that's assuming we even get the cuts that they're talking about in the resolutions, because I'm already reading article after article from GOP members of Congress pushing back. There was the head of the House Agriculture Committee yesterday, was basically quoted as saying, you're not touching food stamps or SNAP or any of that stuff in the farm budget because you're not touching my farm subsidies either. And if you know anything about Washington, they put food stamps in with farm subsidies in one bill so that you get support from the Democrats, support from the Republicans to pass it. Otherwise each one fails separately. Log rolling is what they call it. And so right there, you have somebody taking off the table two items actually, that if you completely zero it out tomorrow, would not materially affect the debt trajectory that we're on, which is unsustainable. So yeah, it's a tough situation. I guess I'm resigned to this at this point. I try to educate. That's why I'm on your show, to talk about these things. It's a much more frustrating environment now because, the hate mail I've received over the years, I've been accused of being a Republican, I've been accused of being a Democrat, a conservative, a liberal. And right now, if you criticize Trump to any degree, it's you have TDS and you're a lib and all kinds of other things. And it's like, no, my job is to call balls and strikes. I work for Republican governor. I work for 2 Republican senators. I've seen how the game is played. I worked with people who had the reputation of being spending cutters and limited government type of Republicans, and hate to break it to you, but in a lot of ways they weren't. And so, I wish the administration well. I wish success to anybody that cuts spending or gets this under control, gets this deficit situation under control. But I'm not going to sit here and tell people that they're doing it and frankly ruin my reputation and that of the Cato Institute by telling people like, oh yeah, they really did uncover $1 trillion in fraud in Social Security, and that's going to solve the problem. Go about your day now and be happy. No, it's simply not true.
In the last presidency to balance the budget, at least on a year-by-year basis, was the Clinton administration. I believe they had 3 or 4 years in a row where they actually were running surpluses. And when Clinton came into office, he had the Clinton National Performance Review, or I should say the National Performance Review of the NPR. They rebranded it to something else.
Reinventing government. Al Gore's Reinventing Government.
Yeah, Reinventing Government. And they basically laid off almost 400,000 federal employees. They actually took us out from yearly deficits to some surpluses, even though over the course of Clinton's administration, they still added to the national debt because they still had more years where they borrowed than when they had surpluses. So is this anything that is realistic? Is there anything they could take away from that Clinton initiative?
Off the top of my head, I can think of 3 things. Let's see if I can remember them. The first thing was the 90s. You got the peace dividend with the end of the Cold War. The Cold War's over. Your defense budget spending retrenches, and you're not involved in outside of Yugoslavia. We didn't have a global war on terror. 9/11 hadn't happened yet. So you had a massive peace dividend. That's number one. Number 2, strong economy. The tech boom, the internet, relatively healthy economy. spending sort of contained both via the peace dividend, and you had a Republican takeover of Congress in '96. And so a lot of people argue that the best outcome for an election is to have divided government, because they sort of are a check on each other. Dems check the Republicans, and vice versa. And so you had that as well. So, peace dividend, divided government, decent economy, and the baby boomers hadn't started retiring. So it was the perfect conditions to at least hit pause. But I now look back on it as simply hitting pause, because to Musk's quote about pulling the roots out, if you don't pull the roots out, the weed grows and it grows back. And Lord knows that the federal government and its apologists and its supporters will find that excuse, whether it's another war, a pandemic. I don't know if have you ever heard of the economist Robert Higgs? I'm going to send you a book link to read it. I read it almost 25 years ago. I wrote a book, Crisis in Leviathan. And I always pitch this book if I get the opportunity on a show. But Higgs' thesis is he looked at the totality of U.S. history. And when a crisis emerges, whether real or perceived, the government takes powers that it didn't previously have, expands those powers, and then when the crisis subsides, it never truly relinquishes what it took. And so you see a ratchet effect over the past 250 years of what he calls Crisis in Leviathan. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. It was like one of those light bulb moments in my life. And, we see something similar with the past few administrations in terms of what I sort of started to talk about was executive power, where the executive branch, Joe Biden thinks he can just cancel billions of dollars in student debt loans. Fortunately, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. But it is true that Congress has abdicated a lot of its authority over the years to the executive branch, to the president, to the point now we have Donald Trump quoting Napoleon, issuing Napoleon quotes about if you're saving the country, then the law doesn't matter. I grew up in a conservative Republican bastion and still know a lot of them in my family and stuff like that. And they used to be pretty protective of the Constitution and concerned about executive overreach and wanted small government and stuff. And now I see this change in their opinions where there are guys in the office and we're use that stick and beat everybody if you can, and they don't really care if it's comports with the Constitution or not. And so that ratchet effect where Bush's powers gave way to more powers for Obama, which gave way to more powers for Trump, which gave way to more powers for Biden. Now back to Trump. We're ratcheting up and ratcheting it up, and we're getting further and further away from a rather clever, genius constitutional model that our founding fathers gave us, that these checks and balances that to keep these branches as co-equals. And so you had mentioned at the very beginning a constitutional crisis. And no, I don't think we have a constitutional crisis right now. I think a lot of what I'm hearing and seeing is disturbing from the standpoint that I just spoke of. But where you will have a constitutional crisis, if the courts weigh in, especially the Supreme Court, and says the executive branch, no, you don't have the power to do that, and they do it anyhow, then yeah, I think based on my understanding and the constitutional scholars I've followed, then yeah, you do have a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, I read a lot of articles from the Cato Institute, a lot from Chris Edwards in particular. And one of the biggest things that the U.S. has kind of gone away from is this whole like federalism, where we have this separation right between the local government and the national government. And I was kind of doing some research and to see what is the most federalistic kind of structure in the world, and it turns out it's probably Switzerland. And in Switzerland, about 25 to 30% of their funding comes from the federal government, and the rest, so the vast majority, 75%, comes from the local. And in the U.S., it's basically the opposite, where about 75% comes from the federal government. And as you were mentioning with Elon Musk saying, pull out these routes, like, yeah, a lot of these departments, right? Shouldn't they just be like taken out, and then at the state level, they would be, implemented? So if the states wanted to do that, you could vote on that, and you could have that. And if the states didn't want to do it, they wouldn't have to do it. And one of the things that I was, because I've read a lot of your articles, one of the things I was kind of thinking about was, like, say California, where California wants to have say Medicaid for illegal immigrants or whatever. Mm-hmm. But then ultimately, who's picking up the tab? It's like the federal government, which means that if you're a person in Appalachia, North Carolina, without any health insurance, you're essentially subsidizing some person in California. And, like, if you wanted to vote on that in North Carolina, your local region, I think that's fine. But, to kind of force other people. And the fact is, that's why we had the Federalist Papers and all this stuff back in the day, right? We're supposed to be more of a federalistic society, and all this pork spending and all these things would just not be in existence if we actually. And, like, to me, I mean, is it as simple as just saying that would that solve a lot of the issues that we have, or is that too simplistic?
No, I'm with Chris Edwards. The two of us are huge fans of fiscal federalism and returning responsibility to state and local government, as was, again, laid out in the Constitution with the enumerated powers. And again, as I get older, I see the genius in it, or the cleverness in it. It makes sense if you're going to have these multi-level form of government, that your national government is going to cover responsibilities that are truly national in scope, things like the currency and the national defense of the country. It makes total sense. And then you leave pretty much everything else left to the states. You've heard of the laboratories of democracy. The states try things. Some things work, some things don't work, but the other states can see it, emulate it, or disregard it, or do the opposite. And it's a great system if you allow it to work. But unfortunately, over the last century, and even more so this century, you've had this erosion of federalism, where more and more federal money goes to the states and local governments. And it's not just money, but it's the strings that come with it, the attachments, the threats that, like Louisiana, when they wanted to lower their legal drinking limit to 18, Department of Transportation at the time said, yeah, go ahead and do it, but you're going to lose your federal highway funding. And so they walked away from it. But more than that, I think something your listeners can appreciate is just how inherently wasteful this redistribution of resources from the federal government to state and local governments is. You talk about your waste. Now, here's where it's at, because if you think about it, we pay taxes, we send it to Washington. All right. So let's take the Department of Education. All right. Department of Education gets a chunk of money from Congress. They take a cut for the bureaucracy, right? Administrative affairs. Not even talking fraud here, just administration. All right. They take it. They send it to the states, and the states, out of that money, take a cut of the funds and use that for administration and other things, and overhead and paperwork. And then they take what's left and send it to local government, who then has to spend chunks of that money on paperwork and administrative, blah, blah, blah. And so by the time the money actually reaches the student in California, any other state, you've lost how much of it just to administrative cost at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, not to mention all the inefficient strings and things that come along with it. So why not just keep the money in California or Pennsylvania or where have you? To me, it makes utterly no sense unless you're making money off of it, unless you're in on it, unless you're one of those people that gets lauded by the media for being a supporter of education and caring about the kids. We've talked about in the last couple of weeks, past month, there's been talk about the Department of Education and the people who the grifters, I would consider the teachers union grifters on there saying this will destroy public education and getting rid of the Department of Education. You don't care about children. No, you know what? It couldn't be the opposite. The folks I know, the folks I work with, the folks that have been doing this for decades, they're opposed to the Department of Education because they actually care about children. They actually care about what they're learning, and they want to see it done effectively and efficiently. And that's not going to happen so long as you run it through this waste mill that's called the Department of Education, which is just a political apparatus that exists to help enrich the pockets of the teachers unions. So overcome that narrative and fight on those grounds. Try and get, and I think people are more receptive to that now after they saw what happened during the pandemic, where the teachers unions led the parade to really screw these kids over in terms of their education and make sure that they were taken care of in terms of finances and protection and everything else. That's why public school enrollment's actually slipped, and you're seeing more traction for private schools and stuff. And of course, they're wailing and gnashing their teeth because their piggy banks being threatened right now. So, yeah, it's a long way of saying, yes, go after federal grants to state and local governments, every bit of it, and pull those weeds out if you can. Leave those responsibilities to the states and local government and the private sector for that matter.
What are the chances we'd ever become more federalist, though? Like, I mean, I would think that Washington has too much power, and none of these bureaucrats, or like you're mentioning, the Department of Education, or whatever, they wouldn't want to let their power go because they would essentially eliminate themselves, right? It seems like the bigger government gets, that there's less likely to actually have a kind of a return to state empowerment.
Are you going to keep asking me questions where I have to say it's hopeless?
Well, I mean, I thought you'd be more positive. Is that?
No. So actually, I'll give you a great example of this. I saw firsthand. So back in the mid 2000s, I went out to work for the state of Indiana, their state office of management and budget, and working for Mitch Daniels. Have you heard of Mitch Daniels?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. He's the guy that still pops up with op-eds in the Washington Post or other places to show his genuine concern and about overspending and efficiency and blah, blah, blah. This guy never missed an opportunity when I worked there. And I didn't work there long because I wasn't going to work there and take a check from Indiana taxpayers if I couldn't save them money. I quit because I couldn't do it. But this guy never missed an opportunity to show up at a ceremony for a new building or a new hire or a new something with a hard hat on, a ceremonial spade, sitting there grinning and taking the credit for it, while some or half or all the money came from the federal taxpayers to begin with. And so that points to, as you say, how do you get state government interested in just saying no when it's quote unquote free money? And that's where you try to make arguments again with the strings and the restrictions and stuff like that. There was a governor during COVID. I can't think. It was a Republican governor. Was it DeSantis? There was somebody. I may actually be confusing it with Jeb Bush when he was governor of Florida. But I'm pretty sure. Anyhow, the bottom line is they rejected federal funds based on the strings, and I'd have to go back and find which that was, but. There have been rare instances where a governor will say, you know what, keep your money. We're going to do things our way, and that's what we need more of. But obviously, it's a difficult dynamic when you have Mitch Daniels who can sit there and pontificate about financial propriety, and then walk out the door the next hand with a check from American taxpayers to use it for boosting his ego and his public standing.
Did you say, was it Alabama that raised their drinking age to 21?
Louisiana. Yeah.
Okay. So anyways, here in Puerto Rico, the drinking age is 18. Mm-hmm. And we had a conversation with a Puerto Rican tax attorney talking about Act 60. And my fiance was kind of like ripping on the roads. Like, she's like, the roads are shit, It was just like a classic Latin America.
Yeah.
But he's like, well, the reason why the roads are shit in Puerto Rico is because Puerto Rico never changed its drinking age from 18 to 21. So therefore they don't get federal transportation dollars.
Oh, I was not aware of that.
And that's like during the pandemic, we were flooded with tourists, mostly spring breakers in Puerto Rico. Why? Well, you weren't leaving America during the pandemic. You couldn't travel abroad, but you could travel to Puerto Rico and you can drink at 18 years of age.
Oh.
Yeah, one of the benefits I would see more of federalism would be the fact that the federal government can print money. I've had podcasts where they're like, well, it's not printing money, it's OPM and blah, blah, blah. They try to make it more complicated than it probably is. But at the state level, you're literally not printing money. Whatever complication you want to talk about. And if you have a legitimate project, yeah, you can take out some municipal bonds or whatever, but you're not really able to just flood that state with, kind of like these emergency dollars and things like that. So at the very least, right, I mean, it seems like if you had more of a federalist model, you really could never get so far into debt, right?
The switch to the federal government covering a bigger share of state and local financial responsibilities has everything to do with the ability to use Uncle Sam's credit card. No doubt about it. And you make a great point. In the early republic, a lot of states got in trouble with canals and issuing debt for fraud-ridden, wasteful projects and internal improvements and things like that. And as a result, a lot of financial trouble. A lot of these states adopted requirements in their constitution about the ability to engage in that sort of behavior. And so what do we do all these years later? Now we have the Federal Community Development Block Grant Program, which sends out a few $1 billion a year to the states so they can spend willy-nilly on sidewalks and beautification projects and things of that nature, and all of which absolutely should be a state and local responsibility. And I think it's another reason why I get frustrated with these governors, because governor such and such is going to cut taxes and things like that. Well, would you still be cutting taxes if you weren't getting 40% of your total spending coming from Washington, D.C.? I mean, look, I love tax cuts and stuff, but a lot of these state governors, they have it pretty easy because so much money's coming from federal taxpayers. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking about like the whole thing with like salt tax as well. It's like, so you can vote in these high tax states for all these whatever, out the wall policies, paying for, homeless people to smoke crack on the street and have your own apartment or whatever. But then they can write all that stuff off federally, which means that people in, North Carolina or Kansas or whatever are subsidizing the person in San Francisco, which never really gets talked about.
There's a principle in public finance that you, to the best you can, you want to match the beneficiary of the service with the people paying for that service. That's how you want to match it. And when you take a local benefit and you move it first to the state level, then to the federal level, you're removing that accountability. You're also incentivizing people not to give a what about the cost of the provision of these services, right? Because you don't feel the pain. You feel the pain a lot differently if local government's going to jump your property taxes by $500 a year to pay for new sidewalks and beautification project, versus if it's being covered in large part by the federal government. You're not feeling those couple pennies that gets passed around the rest of the country, right? Because you're pulling money from a bigger pool. It's a money laundering scheme is really what it is. Again, going back to all the bureaucrats get a cut of the money, and then you get what's left over, and it's just at its face an extremely inefficient, counterproductive way of financing local goods, and you disincentivize civic engagement. The old traditional town hall meetings and stuff, where I guess maybe New Hampshire's about the only place where they still have them yet. But when even at state level, I saw this in Indiana. Even at the state level, when the state says, well, we're going to cut property taxes in exchange for higher state income and sales taxes. Well, it feels good. It feels good for a lot of homeowners because they're writing a smaller check, but they don't realize they're actually paying more through income taxes and sales taxes And the state has now just accomplished the feat of giving people less incentive to care what their local school districts and local governments, how they're spending money and what they're spending money on, because the state has in some degree now assumed the responsibility for it. And so, yeah, we talk about federalism from federal government down, but, even state down, it's a principle that I think applies across the board.
Right now, the federal debt is like $36.2 trillion. So the question is, when would we ever hit, like, what's the number when we would hit a sovereign debt crisis, like, say, Greece? And then secondly, if the US dollar was not the reserve currency, would we have already have hit this point of no return? And how does that, the global reserve currency of the dollar factor into this? And will we not have, at some point, will the US dollar not be the global reserve currency? So I guess I just asked you three I
guess it just boils down to, so long as the world wants dollars, we maintain that benefit. It's interesting. One of the gazillion different tariff threats has been Trump has put tariff threats on so-called BRICS nations, these Russia, China, sort of these emerging economies that have talked about an alternative currency to the United States. And, so long as the United States keeps its fiscal house in order, it's going to maintain that status. I mean, this is still the country where people want to park their money. It's still the place they want to invest. Despite all the negativity and all the potentially bad things to come, it's still arguably the financial stalwart of the world. But your question about, at what point does this blow up? I mean, that's been the $64,000 question since I've started doing this. And I do think reflecting back on these 25 years, I think that constant people like me and other people saying, like, hey, you got to get this spending in order or else we're going to have massive inflation or we're going to have a debt crisis. And then it hasn't happened. And so to some degree, we look like, the proverbial little boy who cried wolf. I think it's more accurate to say that it just simply hasn't. Just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it's going to happen. But I don't think we know with any certainty. There's certainly some economic models and some papers out there that I think I've seen, like when we reach 126% of GDP, that is the debt to GDP ratio of 126%. We're around 100% now, and we're trending in that way. But I think we'll know when the bond buyers say enough is enough, and we demand higher and higher interest rates, and that something's going to have to give. And I think we would very quickly see that if the federal government attempted to truly monetize the debt, the resulting inflation, and then we get into the questions of then what? What are you going to do? Raise taxes? People are already into this illusion in this country that you can simply tax rich people and fix all this stuff. You can't. It's simply not true. We already have one of the most progressive tax systems in the world. Wealthy people pay most of the income taxes. And when you look at all taxes in general, again, it's a very progressive tax system. Almost half of the income taxpayers in the United States who file income tax, they don't pay anything. And a lot of them get money back. We've actually turned the IRS into a sort of welfare program. And then you just throw on on top of the reality that if you tax the most productive people in society, they're going to leave, go elsewhere, employ costly but top-notch accountants to figure some things out. So you can't tax your way out of it. And to the degree that you try to tax your way out of it, you're just going to make things worse. The only solution is cutting spending, which you could have done years ago, you could still do now, but I guess it's emblematic of human nature that we often do things. I'll stop drinking next weekend, and then you find out a week after that you have cirrhosis. So you gotta do it before it happens.
I'll get into debates with people where you're just what you're saying. Basically, like in the U.S., we have one of the most progressive tax systems on the planet. And the fact is, like 50% of of Americans don't pay any federal taxes, minus, of course, payroll, which would be like FICA,
Right.
right? But people will be like, "Oh, that's not true," because they'll see like Jeff Bezos's tax records and be like, "Well, Jeff Bezos paid, 1% or whatever." So, kind of, what's your, or same thing, like Warren Buffett says that his secretary pays more than he does, and of course, you're talking about it in this particular case. You're talking about a very small subset of people. If you're Patrick Mahomes making $50 million a year for the Kansas City Chiefs, you're a W-2 employee, right? Like everything, you're still getting a payroll check just like everyone else. If you're Brad Pitt and you're on a movie set, you're still paying, like you're just a regular W-2 employee. But it seems like some of these maybe investors, like you have, like if you're a Ray Dalio, you have the carried interest, and there's certain things for a certain subset of people. But generally speaking, isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think what we're getting into here is wealth taxes, and I think a lot of people on the left, and maybe I'm sort of speaking off the top of my head here, maybe in the last 5-10 years, sort of understand that the income tax isn't how you're going to get the money out of the billionaires and such like that you want, that you have to go after the wealth. And the best I can say about it, wealth tax doesn't make any sense to me because you're taxing on unrealized gains, and so they could go up, they could go down. I'm not an expert on this topic, but I am aware that they've tried this, I believe, in France and other places. It was a total failure. Your most productive members of society say, adios, I'm out of here. You never get the money you think you're going to get. It becomes a game of whack-a-mole. And so, and I don't even think it was pass constitutional muster to have a wealth tax. So I think that's where the Buffett thing comes from, and people don't want to hear that. Private sector investment and savings is the key to economic growth, and you call it trickle down, you call it anything else, but I'd much rather Warren Buffett, well, maybe not him sometimes, but some of these other folks, I'd rather have their spend their money in the private sector buying things than having it sent to Washington, and Washington fritters it away at special interest and other counterproductive measures.
Well, yeah, what you're getting at, though, I think is what a lot of people don't understand is if you're, say, Jeff Bezos and the vast majority of your wealth is wrapped up in your stock. So if you don't sell your stock, you really never had a taxable event. Where if you're, say, Patrick Mahomes and you're getting this $50 million salary plus, whatever, promotions and ads you do, like that's all a taxable income. And so like people are kind of comparing apples to oranges, really.
Yes. Yeah. And but the average person doesn't understand that they're conflating wealth with income, and that you actually have a actualized event versus just something on paper. I mean, yeah, you get taxed for $100 billion of wealth, and the next year, let's say the market goes down, your company goes under, now you're down to $50 billion in wealth. But, was that fair? And so, again, those savings that Bezos and such have, I mean, look, space travel and all these things, let them take that wealth and do things with it. I go back to the Carnegies and the museums and the infrastructure and the things they've done. People don't realize it. They just hear billionaire, and I hate to say it, but this is where I'm at after all these years. They hear billionaire and they think, person with lots of money, how can I get it? It's almost like the waste fraud. It's like the corollary with waste, fraud, and abuse and spending. Oh, the problem is just waste, fraud, and abuse. Give me my check. Everything will be okay. Just give me that other person's money and don't touch my program. Just get rid of the fraud. Everything will be fine. And unfortunately, it doesn't work in the long run.
My wife's kind of like a chief of staff for, she's worked for several billionaires, and the number of succubuses that surround those people is insane. I mean, they're just leeches.
Yeah.
And of course these people think like they're like, well, they can afford it. Like, it's just like and I mean, I have so many examples, but I don't really plan on saying them on this podcast.
Yeah. No.
So Tad, basically on February 3rd, 2025, President Donald Trump, he signed an executive order to create a U.S. sovereign wealth fund. You then wrote a article on the Cato Institute website that was titled U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund is a Bad Idea. And then in this fact sheet for the whitehouse.gov, it says that the U.S. already holds a vast sum of highly valued assets that can be invested through a sovereign wealth fund for greater long-term wealth generation. The federal government directly holds $5.7 trillion in assets. The biggest, kind of like wealth holder in the world is BlackRock at something like $11 trillion. But it seems like a terrible idea if the U.S. is going to be, kind of like wielding a stick with a sovereign wealth fund of $5.7 trillion.
Well, and they're not even going to get $5.7 trillion. I mean, what are they going to do? Sell off the student loans, sell off all the other loan programs, and then put that money? It's ridiculous. I mean, sure, if you want to sell some land and properties and things like that, go for it. But let's just set aside the ridiculous nature of turning that $5.7 trillion into liquidizing it and coming up with cash for your sovereign wealth fund. Pay down the debt. Or if you want more tax increase or tax cuts, use it to finance that. What do you need to put in a sovereign wealth fund, a giant pot of politicized money that, I could make the argument that you'd really want a guy that can, is quoting Napoleon in charge of that. And you say, well, you just hate Trump. Well, do you want President AOC in 2029? Do you want her appointing people to run the sovereign wealth fund of the United States? No, it's just an absolute invitation for corruption, for political meddling, for picking winners and losers. Why do we want returns from the stock market going to the federal government, going to some slush fund for Uncle Sam instead of going into our 401ks and pensions? All of this on top of the fact that when you have a sovereign wealth fund, and I think you already know this, it's largely financed around the world. It's financed by natural resources. So like Norway has one, or budget surpluses. And, we don't have a budget surplus. So we're going to have a $2 trillion debt this year. We've just spent almost an hour talking about the debt problem. So what are you going to do? Create more debt and then stick it in a wealth fund? It's such a stupid idea. And I really honestly, I think the truth is that Trump wants it because it fits his ego. It fits his, the rich and powerful Saudis have one, Putin has one, I need one. And I think that's an abysmal, disgraceful way to conduct economic policy in this country. Is just because you want a big toy like everybody else. Some of these other, and it's not like everybody else has a big toy. Oftentimes it's Saudi Arabia. Is that who we're trying to emulate? Are we going to try and emulate Norway, which is a tiny country? We're a big, powerful country. We don't need a sovereign wealth fund. Give them money, cut the debt, cut the spending, cut the taxes, leave the money in the private sector, and let them do the investment, and let them reap the returns. That's what made America strong. That's what will continue to keep it strong. That's what will make it stronger. Not having all this wealth tied up in some politicized piggy bank.
Do you ever watch the All In podcast with Chamath and Jay Cal and David Freeberg, David Sachs? But I mean, Chamath was, a big fan of it. I mean, what would be the case for if you were to try to make a case for having the sovereign wealth fund?
You're a smaller country with limited resources, and I'm thinking obviously of Norway. And let's say you have a ton of oil and natural resources, and you take a percentage of that and you put it in a fund and you invest it across the globe, and you earn returns then that you can use for uh, uh, true citizens' needs, important stuff. All right. You have those things. That's not the United States. There's no need for one in the United States. There's no reason to have one in the United States. We don't have excess money to put into it. Why would you issue more debt to generate returns for a politicized piggy bank of money? The taxpayers have to pay debt, and then private investors lose out on the returns because they're going to Uncle Sam instead. So they can spend money on what? I don't. What am I missing here? Washington has enough money. It spends too much money and too much stuff. It doesn't need to get more.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking, like with the whole Twitter files coming out, talking about how under the Biden administration, they were censoring COVID, et cetera, et cetera. I was thinking, man, imagine if you had this $1 trillion slush fund known as a sovereign wealth fund, and then the government was like calling up, say they're owning like 50% of Google or 30% of Twitter or 50% of Facebook, and they just like call up, Zuckerberg, like, hey, probably they might even have voting shares on the board or whatever, right? It's like, hey, like, we want you to like cancel, 50,000 of these people, whatever. I mean, like, yep. as with voting, like, wouldn't they be able to do that? I mean, it seems ridiculous.
Absolutely. And so I mentioned in the piece that Trump's even thrown out the idea of buying 50% of TikTok and putting that in a sovereign wealth fund. I mean, if you're concerned about the Chinese government getting your data and spying on you and stuff like that, you're not concerned about Uncle Sam doing the same. And let's say that you just love Trump, you got the red foam hat on, and he's the greatest, and Jesus sent him, and all that stuff. He's going to be gone someday. He's not going to be there. And then what? What if it's AOC or
Gavin Newsom?
Yeah, President Gavin Newsom. What do you think's going to happen with that? What if he's has the government has 50% control of your social media outlet, and you hate green spending and stuff like that, and Gavin says, we need to crack down on this disinformation and TikTok about green energy is a waste and stuff like that. And oh man, this is one of the biggest mistakes I see over and over again with every election cycle is people are so short-sighted, and they want their guy to have these powers and to do everything and wield absolute control, and they forget or they ignore or they just don't appreciate that at some point in time they die or they leave and they retire, and somebody else is going to come in, and you may wish that you had not given one the power because somebody else can wield it and do a lot worse with it.
In that piece talking about the sovereign wealth fund, you talk about the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund, which apparently they misappropriated $4.5 billion, and the prime minister ended up with a 12-year prison sentence. But then, so I was doing a little research into this in preparation for this podcast, and then it turns out that I'm not sure if you knew this because you didn't mention it, but maybe you do. But the stepson of the prime minister owns a production company in the U.S., and his production company used the stolen money to fund the Hollywood production, The Wolves of Wall Street. What's like how ironic?
I had no idea.
So, and then anyways, apparently last March, the company agreed to pay like the Malaysian government a fine of $60 million, though they released a statement stating that it was not an admission of wrongdoing. But I just thought it was pretty hilarious. They also funded Dumb and Dumber 2 as well, which was pretty ridiculous. But it's like the amount of corruption, and then apparently Angola, which has a lot of oil money, they have a sovereign wealth fund. Apparently, the president of Angola, he had his kid as the chairman of the board, and then apparently a few years later, billions of dollars just went missing. Surprise, surprise. And then they say apparently Malta, which also has a sovereign wealth fund, their sovereign wealth fund is funded by their golden passport. So then they're thinking they have a lot of like Russian oligarchs and things like that. So you have a bunch of stolen money funding like essentially like a trust fund for Like the whole thing is just like absolutely ridiculous. I said I did a podcast on sovereign wealth funds, and like, I mean, it's just maybe if you have really good people in charge, but man, like once those really good people die off or retire out, like it's so ripe for corruption.
Well,
It's insane.
the Angola one immediately popped in my mind. I just pictured Joe Biden appointing Hunter Biden, and then I thought of Donald Trump appointing Donnie Jr. Um, I mean, no, bad idea, bad idea.
And then, of course, we have Saudi Arabia, which, is like a classic case for with oil money. But then Saudi Arabia has bought up all these like sport teams abroad. And, aren't they like, what is it, like the golf thing they own? Was it Newcastle? Live. Yeah, Live. Yeah, they own Newcastle United Soccer Team, and they call it like sports washing. Well, basically, like you just like murder and do genocide back home, but then you go to these like different sporting events and you're like, hobnobbing with the different athletes, and you're kind of like framed in the media in this positive light.
But that's good tonight. This is why Trump loves this stuff. He loves that stuff. I mean, he's involved in this Live PGA Tour potential merger. And I think there's an article in Wall Street Journal last night or today, but talking about all the money Trump stands and his family stands to make, from getting the Saudis involved with the PGA Tour and stuff. And I just read that, and it's like it's such an obvious conflict of interest. You obviously aren't just involving, like, why is the president of the United States involved in a merger between a foreign Gulf? Why? We're $36 trillion in debt. We have spending. There's so many things you could be doing. Why you focus on a golf league? Well, apparently it's lucrative. So again, if we want to use that for what we talked about today, about the executive branch having too much power, about the federal government having too much power vis-a-vis the state and local government, it's these little things like that show that things have just become far exceeded what our founding fathers ever had in mind for this country, and the results speak for itself.
Well, you say little, but if you're talking about trillions of dollars, I mean, how little is that? I mean, I would love to have that little bank account if that's your definition of little. I'll take $2 trillion. I mean, you want to share with me, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's little for me, but I guess when you have something like that almost every other day with Trump, it does. I guess they're all big, but it seems little because there's so many of them.
And you also mentioned in the article that basically you say that it was reported that the Biden administration was actually one that was first exploring. So like you said, like, so, if you don't want Biden doing it or AOC, why would you want, and I'm with you. Like, I personally think more power should be returned to the states.
Yeah. I think I'm not 100% sure on this, but Trump had brought up the sovereign wealth fund, and then before. And then I think the Biden White House started looking into it towards the end, and of course, then Harris didn't win, and that went out the door, and then so Trump brought it back up. I mean, I guess it has an idea that's been around there for a while, but it's never. This is the most serious attempt because now it's an executive order directing the U.S. government to look into setting one up. So, and you know what's funny about that is that comes up. In any other time in my career, that would have been the story for like a month. Now, I wrote that blog post. By the next day, not a comment on it. We've moved on to something else. And that's what's difficult, I think, as a policy analyst. People ask me, friends and family, about, who wins this election between Trump and Harris? What's it going to mean for your job? And I say, well, I mean, for me, libertarian, whoever wins, I lose. I'm going to be busy complaining about, trying to find some good things, but it's not going to be pretty. But with Trump, again, I wake up in the morning and you're wondering what happened the night before. And so there is this intentional strategy that this White House pursues to sort of flood the zone strategy, where you toss so much stuff out there and so fast and so often that there's not enough time to take each and every one of them and give it the full attention it deserves, to look through it, to consider it and stuff like that. And so you just have idea after idea, suggestion after suggestion. coming out after there, and it's almost exhausting to keep up with, and it's intentional. I mean, that's regardless of where you sit, to some degree, has been effective for him, because the man says and does things that any other president just never could have gotten away with it. So there is you have to, whether it's good for the country or not, I would say it's not, but in terms of how they like to do things, it's a success.
And talking about the sovereign wealth fund, the only thing I heard about it was from your article, but I heard it first was from the All In podcast, and they were in favor of it. And it's like, yeah, of course they're in favor of it, because they would probably be one of the people in charge of it. David Sachs from the podcast is already the crypto and the AI czar. And then as in your article, you basically say, like, essentially this would bring the U.S. a kind of socialism, right? Where essentially, again, like we said, okay, why don't they buy 50% of Google, and then they could just, change the search results? Like, we're the biggest investor, we got board, see if we can do it,
I gave the example of U.S. Steel. The whole Biden administration did its best to kill the Nippon Steel purchase of U.S. Steel, and couldn't you just see Trump, if he had a sovereign wealth fund for the federal government, can you just see him say, hey, we'll take a 25%? That's his mentality. He just, everybody loves that. He's a businessman. He doesn't think like a politician. Well, sometimes you need to think like a government official, not a businessman, because you know what? The federal government's not a business, nor should it be.
Ted DeHaven, policy analyst for the Cato Institute. 2 final questions. Just where can people find you, get a hold of you, that kind of information if you want to share that information? And then secondly, leave us with a final thought related to this podcast or whatever you want to discuss that we didn't touch on.
Okay. All right. Well, the reach out part, www.cato.org. That's cato.org. You can find me and my esteemed colleagues on there. And one thing I'll say about us is, that's why I work for Cato, is we try to call balls and strikes. We don't receive government money. Most of our money comes from individual donors. We criticize Republicans. We criticize Democrats. We applaud Republicans and we applaud Democrats. I've been around this scene for a long time, and there's not a lot of places like Cato that you have that intellectual honesty. So even if you come and you read and you disagree and you hate something you read something else, because you may find something you like, and at least give it a chance and recognize that at least you're being presented neutral takes in a world where things are either red or blue when you turn on the TV screen. And I'll use that as part of my final wrap up. Is a question I get asked a lot is, in this day and age, sort of getting to that red information and blue information. It's unfortunate, but people tune in to hear what they want to hear. It sort of gets to the whole waste and fraud and abuse thing. Is that's what people want to hear. They don't want to hear that there's not enough money or the program shouldn't exist. They just want to hear that somebody else is stealing from it. And if we stop that, then everything's going to be fine and my benefits can commence. It's very difficult, but my advice is try to get outside of your echo chamber. If you're continually following people on social media and the news or TV or whatever, and you're just constantly bobbing your head, yes, 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 there's a good chance you're getting it wrong or you're misinformed. And read what the opposition says, read what the apparently neutral says, read different things, because you're not doing yourself, you're not doing your family or friends, you're not doing a country a service by just tuning in and hearing what you want to hear and being told what you want to be told. So, and you can also find me on Twitter. I just got back in 2023, so I don't have a lot of followers. This is probably good because it cuts down on my hate mail, but I'm at DeHaven Tad, at DeHaven TAD. So give me followers, please.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.